Hello everyone, I'm Leslie Cornwell, Certified Nurse Midwife with Midwifery Business Consultation. I wanted to do a presentation about selling a birth center practice. You can apply a lot of these tips and suggestions to other midwifery practices, but I would say the most common one I get called about is a birth center because there's so many more complex things to that transition compared to a home birth practice. So the objectives of this presentation is to help with a current business owner, typically a midwife, how to successfully sell their birth center practice. We'll talk about different benefits of strategic planning, why it's important to have time on your side and have the experts help you with that transition. We're going to talk about the different ways you can sell a practice. We're going to talk about the ways to value it, how to negotiate the best deal, and being very objective and fair at the same time. We're going to talk about the people on your team to have while you're planning the selling, while you're looking for the right buyer, and after the close of the deal, a smooth transition for the new business owner. So there's a lot of different things that are part of making a birth center selling so successful, and we're going to go over those things today. So in introduction, there's just a lot to think about. You have a building, you have supplies, you have a brand, you have a staff, you have contracts, you have credentials. There is a lot with selling a birth center practice that many midwives get overwhelmed, don't even know where to start in the process, or they choose to do it when it needs to be more of a rushed emotional decision versus a planned transition. So some of the things we're going to talk about are the negotiating, the timelines, how to appraise, what are the things to think about legally, ethically, how to support that new business owner. So our ultimate goal, even though you're going to sell and get a good value, is we want the birth center to continue staying open long term to support families in the community. So why do you want a smooth transition? We kind of hinted at the three main reasons that people think of. The number one thing is you want to support the community. I've heard too many times birth centers, they're the only one in the state, they're the only one open, the midwife gets burnt out and it closes. And now the families don't have a place to go that had served them very successfully for many years in the past. So we want to serve our families. We want this practice to continue for generations. We want it to grow. We want the past owners' strength and learning curve to help with the next generation of midwives or whoever decides to purchase the birth center. A lot of midwives don't see the value. They look at their birth center as an income stream while they're working there. They don't give enough credit and recognition to the power of the value of their business to making a retirement income. You can have a nice, steady, passive income after you sell your business from structuring the right deal. So I don't think enough midwives give credit. They'll say, oh, I'll just close and liquidate my supplies and another new midwife will just open. You've just lost so much equity and value you've put into that business by having a rushed closing and liquidating the practice versus a smooth transition to a new owner. Legacy creation, I think this is so important. So many midwives are interested in starting their own private practices. I would much rather see a midwife purchase an established practice that's got good business foundation because their chances of success goes up so much higher. They can learn from the past midwife. They can take over an established practice that instantly has a revenue stream, instantly has a history, instantly has all these things set up that are a lot of work and time. So legacy creation, not just for the community, but it's also for the midwives and the next generation to have something to grow and expand on versus we're just starting over from scratch every single time a midwife wants to open a practice. So these are the tentative goals for selling a birth center timeline. There's no hard rules. It could be a couple years, it could be 5 years, it could be 7 to 10 years. Everybody is different and their unique needs. I just get nervous when midwives call me and they have 6 months to 9 months to make this decision, or they're very abruptly going to close and retire. It makes it very hard to make a smooth transition because there's so many things you want to think about and put together and find the right person to buy their practice. So in a perfect world, our goal would be between 2 to 5 years in advance of thinking. And that's why having a retirement plan in place, having a financial planner, a mastermind team of an accountant, a lawyer, all these people are going to be meeting with you and not just thinking about year by year in real time. They're going to be also thinking of your future for your business, for your personal life, so that you can plan ahead. So there's just a lot of benefits to having that timeline, and just considering if you want to sell in the next few years, getting that paperwork and getting that transition going sooner than that. Meeting with those experts, meeting with business consultants, meeting with medical practice evaluators, meeting with accountants, lawyers, your current business partners. It will really help you make the best decision of where do you want to go. Do you want to just get cash and sell all at once and not have to be part of the practice anymore because you want to travel the world? Do you want to sell it now, but in 5 years still work at your practice as a consultant, as a midwife on staff, to help with that transition to the new owners? Like, what level relationship do you want with the birth center after the selling occurs? And there's personal decisions to it, and there's financial decisions. People don't realize all the tax implications and all the financial decisions that happen with how you want to structure that birth center selling deal. Listing it, once you've made the decision, you kind of have a tentative idea of what do you want to be the bank for a potential seller. Do you want to make sure that you pick somebody that has a good amount of down payment funds so that they can get a loan with a bank? You have to have a good sense of what you're looking for before you list your practice. And there's many different resources. There's unfortunately not nearly as many as traditional businesses and medical practices, but as midwives, we really are a small community and word spreads fast. So understanding what your different networking opportunities to get your selling of your practice out there. But it's also that art of not being too public if you don't want to be, because it causes fear and anxiety to the community. So you want to have this delicate art of non-disclosure agreements with potential people you're talking to, making it public but not too public. So a lot of times just networking and word of mouth is really helpful to get started. Once you get some potential buyers, you start going down the due diligence and they are a good fit to purchase your practice, you want to start negotiating and knowing objectively where the value, if you're asking for $1 million for your birth center, you have to objectively show where that is coming from. Is it the supplies? Is it you being on as a business consultant for a while? Is it the building? Is it the contracts? Is it the revenue stream? Like, where are you calculating that value from? And then the last but not least, this is the most important part, kind of like birth. We always think we focus so much on birth, but we don't give as much credit to postpartum. That smooth transition is just as important as the creating the deal. You don't want things to crumble in that practice, to not be successful after you leave, because you worked so hard to create it. You want to serve this community even after you leave the baby you've created. So you want to make sure there's a smooth transition for the new business owners. They've never owned a birth center before. So definitely showing the value of your consulting work, of you staying on to support them in whatever level you're comfortable is it's so vital. The staff transition, the education of the community, whether you want it public or you want it silent transition, those are things to definitely think about. So you've now made the decision. I want to sell my birth center in X amount of years. I want to sell my birth center in 2 years. I want to sell my birth center in 5 years. I want to retire around 7 years. We want to have a realistic timeline, because just because you say you want to sell does not mean you're going to retire. Does not mean you have to leave working at your practice. You just have a different role in that practice. So those are things that a lot of midwives I just noticed don't think about. When they think of selling, they're like, I want to retire, I want to be done, and I want to be done now. And so that time component is very, very challenging to get you the best deal, to find you the potential buyers, and to make a smooth transition for these birth centers. I would say I rarely see a smooth transition of a birth center purchasing, because there's so much business component side of planning that midwives are living day to day. They're taking care of clients, and then all of a sudden they start getting burnt out, and they're feeling like now is the time. And that 3 to 6 month window is very, very difficult to successfully sell a business in general, especially a birth center business. So you need to just think about long term. And just because you're thinking about it doesn't mean, just because you're looking and you're considering and you're making a tentative plan if you want to retire in 5 years, maybe the most amazing prospective buyer will come up, but maybe they don't. But at least you have time on your side to make those decisions. We want to increase the value of the profit potential. If you are more selective of the potential buyers, you're going to be able to negotiate a better deal. Motivated sellers, you can feel it. I mean, as a real estate investor, as a business owner, if you have a motivated seller, they're going to know you don't have time on your side. They're going to figure that out, and you're not going to get the best deal possible, even though there may or may not be that extensive value present. You're going to have more people exposed. If you've got time on your side and you've listed it for a longer period of time, you're going to have more potential buyers. There may be a midwife out there that's halfway in school, and she sees this listing and she starts having a discussion with you. Now she can do clinicals at your practice. Now she can, you can hire her as a new graduate. She gets a year of experience, and you have a plan from the beginning. She's going to buy the birth center. That is so different than a midwife that's halfway through school and she sees it's listed and you're going to close your door in 3 months. She doesn't have the time and the resources to commit to it. She loves the idea. It's her hometown, but the timing isn't there for her. So leave a longer window for these potential buyers to plan and to think, because it's just like you're wanting to get out. Many of the potential buyers need time to figure out funding, to plan, to transition, just as much as you need it. There's a lot of tax benefits to planning ahead of time. If you can structure the deal where it's paid a little bit over time and you become their bank versus a lump sum all at once, you have significant tax savings. Plus, you get the interest on the business loan you're providing them. So it's like icing on the cake. You want to sell your practice for $1 million, but you've just made $200,000 in interest over the next 5 to 7 years. There's a lot of added value to you being the financer for this loan. There may be some great midwives interested in purchasing, but they don't have 20 to 35% down to put at the bank or a private money lender to make this deal happen. So those are some perks if you are more open to a gradual transition of ownership versus an abrupt one. So I want to talk about these two pretend midwives that I've met with and had conversations, Jill and Jane. They're definitely two very different scenarios. Jill is a person that absolutely was so excited about having her practice. She's had her dream practice for 30 years, and COVID hit, and she is exhausted and she is tired and she is ready to be done. She had no idea the overhead responsibilities, the costs, the regulation changes. This isn't the type of midwife she wanted to be. She wants to travel. She wants to have some TLC. She hasn't really had much of a vacation. And so she calls me as a consultant, saying that I've helped other birth centers with making a smooth transition. And her timeline goal is 3 months. She wants to be done by December. No ifs, ands, or buts. Her practice staff already knows. She wants help with getting the awareness out there and wants to help make it a quick transition. And my heart goes out for those starting conversations, because it is very, very difficult. It almost takes a miracle to make a successful transition in 3 months. You just have to have the right person. They're motivated. They have the right connections of funds. It's very difficult to make that abrupt of a decision. And unfortunately, that's what most of the phone calls I have with midwives are. It's more of, I am tired, I'm exhausted, I want to retire in a very short amount of time because I am ready. And that makes it hard. Most of the time, those birth centers liquidate. Those birth centers do not get nearly the value from their business transaction as they would have if we had those years and we had those conversations and made it a smooth transition. Jane, on the other hand, who's an outlier, she's been meeting with her planner. She's got a good business foundation. She has decided, in the next 5 years, I would like to retire. I've been living comfortably. I love all the midwives I've trained. I've loved all the families I've served. But, my kids are starting to get out of college, talking about getting married. I want to be around for the grandbabies. I want to travel. I haven't gotten to do much of it. I'm in that good place where I think let's talk about selling. Let's talk about finding a great midwife to take over what I've established. That is a completely different conversation with Jane than it is with Jill. Jane has time on her side. Jane has us being able to think cognitively about the strategic plan that makes the most sense for her and her needs and her goals for her practice, versus Jill is strictly on emotions. She's burnt out, she's exhausted, and I've been there. Like, I know exactly how Jill feels, and you just want it all to go away. And that's where these wonderful midwifery birth centers just disappear. And so I want to get more Janes in the world and get less of these Jills happening so we can have more long-term birth center history in the United States. So you want to meet with the experts. Meeting with the experts is important when you're planning your practice, when you're growing your practice, you're reducing that risk, you're evaluating things, because you want to leverage the experts that are around you. And I talk about this often, but when you're doing exit strategies for your business and your birth center thought process, it's so vital to have a group meeting with these key people, with your planner, with a business evaluator, with a lawyer, an accountant. You want to have a group meeting with all of them because they're all going to have different angles of expertise to bring to that decision making. You don't want to have scattered meetings because your accountant's going to look at the tax implications. Your lawyer's going to look at the way to protect you legally and some rules of how to set it up so you're protected, and the potential buyers of how those contracts could look, so you get that win-win situation. You want a business evaluator, particularly business consultants who work with birth centers, because it's very difficult if you don't know truly what it's worth. How are you going to list it? How are you going to negotiate? How are you going to have a sense of what kind of retirement pension business structure deal you can even have long-term to live off of? So it's really, really important to plan at least a couple of years in advance if you're considering selling your business, your birth center, so that we can, as a team, help come up with the best transaction for you. So these are hard discussions to have because midwives are so emotionally attached to their practices, and it's a very delicate discussion. When I a lot of times will be the middle person between the buyer and the seller to make an objective decision, because there's no way to say, well, I want $1 million, but I think it's only worth $500,000. How do you negotiate fairly and objectively where the different values come from? So sometimes it's a very delicate discussion, especially when it's a midwife that owns the practice and there's another midwife that's worked there for a really long time that's thinking about buying it, because we want to keep a good working relationship while we're considering the purchase transaction, because it may or may not work out. Plus, I give the example of, to the potential buyers, especially if they've worked there, you're trying to buy grandma's house. You're trying to buy the love, the history, and you respect this person immensely that you're purchasing the birth center from. but you also want to be respectful because grandma's been a hoarder. Grandma hasn't been paying her bills very well. This birth center isn't financially sound. The midwife barely pays herself and there's no profits on the books. They're barely making money. Yes, they're serving lots of women. There's a love there. There's a mission and a value. But if you can't show the financial profitability, you have to take the emotions out. And I've had numerous conversations with midwives, especially the more attached they are to the practice and the history and the clients, the more muddied that perception of where the true value comes from. So it's really important to be objective. We sit and we talk about the profits and the losses the last 3 years. We talk about all the things that the practice has, the tangible assets, the intangible assets, and we make a list and we negotiate. If you had to replicate these exact same things, what would it cost you? What would, if you were going to start a brand new practice and do what is here, what is the value of those clients, those contracts, those established deliveries where you're making money from day one versus if you start a practice, you have a gradual bringing in of income and breaking even point. So there is value there, but we have to delicately talk about those things. So when we make a value, if you're thinking of selling in 2 years to 5 years, there's a very different value to the practice than if you want to sell in 2 months. If you are motivated to sell quickly, you have to take a cut off the value because otherwise you're going to run out of time and get nothing. So it's hard if I have a midwife that's saying, I want to retire in 2-3 months. This is what I think it's worth. I'm like, you're going to probably have to get a half of that because if you don't find any buyer in 2 months, you've got nothing. So we have to have an honest conversation and a respectful one of what's realistic. If you really want to sell in 2 to 4 months, you better make it a great deal to somebody that they're going to quickly close and make that decision versus they're going to think about it. They're going to take time to make that big decision of buying your practice. We want to show to the potential buyers the value. We want to be able to have the greatest connections, connect with the greatest prospects. So you want to, and that's where it's a big art of, if you want the community to publicly know that you're going to sell the practice, you may have the community want to buy the birth center. You may have a group of families or a past client that has financial means that really loves the birth center. It doesn't have to be a midwife. And I think it's important for midwives to be open and show that, I care about my community. I'm considering retiring in 5 years, and I would love to know if someone is interested in taking over this wonderful practice for me. That's going to give the community confidence that you're planning and thinking ahead for them versus cause them fear and anxiety. So there's different ways to value a birth center. The easiest, more traditional way to value a business in general is income and expense sheets. So that's your Schedule C tax forms, and seeing the profit margins from the last 3 years. It's a very simple way to do it. It shows the return on investment. It shows the value that the person, if they're putting in their own hard-earned money to buy this business, they want to know what money they're going to make out of it. You can get once in a while a philanthropy, a foundation, a nonprofit that's bought by the community where it's the mission and values and getting grants. Most birth centers are private. Most birth centers are going to be bought by someone that wants to invest in a business that will make them money. And so you can make the money and they can serve families. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's also value. You can do it different ways. Maybe on the books, there is no profit margin. The midwife's part of the team. She has a low-end salary. She loves what she's doing. She lives a frugal life. The potential buyer isn't going to want to replace her working 40, 50, 60 hours a week, making a low-end midwifery salary. They're looking at buying this business to be the business owner and replace the owner on the staff. So that's going to even make the profit margins even lower. So you have to think about those things, especially if you want more value for your birth center, you might work with a consultant and improve the revenue streams for the next 3 years before you list the practice. So now you've got a lot more value. It looks more attractive. You'll have more prospective buyers. That's also part of the strategic planning. Is maybe there's no value on paper right now, but let's work the next 2 to 3 years to improve the revenue streams, improve the efficiency, make it look more valuable to that prospective buyer. And then that'll increase your retirement savings because you'll have additional profits and things to live off of. You can value it strictly by liquidating supplies, the building getting a comp, getting an appraised value for the birth center, the supplies, the construction cost that's been done inside the building. Those are more tangible things that traditionally I see when more rush situations, people will just sell the business, not even selling the business and the branding, literally just sell the building, the birth center, the land, the tangible assets in like a liquidation sale. There's other ways to value the practice. This is more subjective, but the value of clients and the contracts. So particularly if you have a really good insurance contract, how did you negotiate it? There's financial value to that contract to continue the big business entity and to have that contract. Like if all the providers had to get re-credentialed, you had to renegotiate contracts, that gets expensive. So I talk to midwives about insurance contracts. If it's a good one, that may have $5,000, $10,000, $12,000 worth of value to it if we can objectively show it. Your clients, if you've been around for 30 years and you are at max capacity of waiting list, you have 90% of your services are referral basis where you don't have a marketing budget, there is value there. But you have to be careful because if there's no competition in the area, the potential buyer could say, will you close your doors? I open tomorrow. They're looking for a birth center. They're not looking for the name of the birth center. So you just have to be careful how you negotiate that aspect of the value. And that puts us into that branding and reputation. You want to show, when you work so hard to create policies, protocols, reputation, you know the hospital administration, the physicians, the pediatricians, the obstetricians, you have all this referral networking that you've created for your practice. It does have value to it, but you have to know objectively how to show that prospective buyer where that value is and what time was committed to build those relationships that they are getting with the birth center. So the profit margin is the easiest one. That tends to be a traditional way most businesses are valued. But I think for birth centers, it's hard because we don't have those. Typically, when I see other birth centers, those phenomenal profit margins to brag about. The midwives are on staff as part of the team, and so that profit margin isn't as accurate if somebody wants to be the business owner and buy this versus replacing that midwife who's been self-employed the last 30 years. So you have to be careful, and those are part of my hard discussions when midwives are considering buying a practice. If they're saying the practice is worth $1 million and there is $200,000 average coming in for profit the last 3 years, that's a 20% return on investment. Most of the practices I see, they have a $600,000-$800,000 overhead with a birth center practice, but they're lucky if they're breaking even. They're lucky if they're making $20,000, $30,000. And so when I talk to a midwife and I say, get your calculator out. If you bought this for $800,000 and you're making $20,000 on it, what is your return on investment? It's like minimal. It's 1 to 3%. And I said, you could put your money in a bond, a mutual fund, there's so many tools out there, that a whole life insurance policy, you could do so many things where you don't have any responsibility, you don't have any of that headache. And that's part of when we, as a decision maker for prospective buying, you're affecting your lifelong decision. So we want to show to potential buyers that there's profit, there's value. This is the core of valuing a business. Tangible assets, which are the more common way, because if there's not financial profits, a lot of times the business will just be more liquidated and they're just selling the supplies in the building. And so a lot of midwives lose so much potential income and value and creation of worth in their planning stage just by that rush transition. So when we do a evaluation of a birth center, I use multiple different things, and maybe you have a potential buyer and a potential seller that both just want to use the profit margin. That makes it easy. Most of the time we're doing a hybrid list of what are all the supplies the practice has, what's the average tenure of the staff that works there, that training, that knowledge, that expertise has value, what's the average clients that are coming up due the next 6 to 8 months, what's the average reimbursement for deliveries, what are the contracts. If you're licensed as a birth center, that accreditation process is very expensive. Your policies, your procedures, there's so much value present, but we have to break it up and show if they were going to replicate that, what would it cost? It's just started versus an average birth center when it starts out with planning and opening its doors, you're not going to get much revenue till the first year and a half of opening, because it's 9-month window of the women delivering. Then the insurance takes 3 to 6 months to get reimbursed. That's a long time of needing overhead expenses and staff wages paid for, and that costs money. You've got to borrow it, you've got to have it. Versus you have a business, a birth center that already has the staff, already has the systems, already has that flow. There is tremendous value if the potential for selling isn't a rush situation. So for the clients and the contracts, you want to talk about what's the average, what is the value? We don't like to objectively count a client as a number, but when you're doing a deal, you have to figure out a fair way to objectively count that. So if you have women coming up that are going to deliver with you, there's a financial reimbursement that's coming from those women. If you have a lot of ladies, like especially a religious affiliated practice where they have a lot more babies, there's actually more financial value in the clients when they're having 8, 9, 10 kids than when that client is more of the traditional American lifestyle, having 2 children. If you're doing a lot of GYN services with your practice, there's a lot of revenue there. GYN RVU codes are actually higher reimbursement per time capital than the birth charges. So if you're doing a lot of primary care, you're taking care of a lot of teenagers that are eventually going to get pregnant, you're becoming that branded, established reputation for the community, there is that value of the projections of these women that you are taking care of, and them are going to have kids, they're going to need menopausal support. There's a lot of benefits to putting a quantifiable value to the clients. The last part we talk about is just those insurance contracts, depending if you're in network, out of network, if you negotiated a good deal, when's the last time you negotiated the deal, how old are your fee schedules, do you compensate for inflation, do you increase them with time? That may be a potential for the buyer if you haven't been increasing your fee schedule and haven't been negotiating your contracts. But as far as selling, that might be something strategically to improve your profit margins for your practice, to work on those next couple years before you list the practice. And even just the AABC, CABC accreditation, the state licensure takes time. It's money, it's overhead. People don't give enough credit. If you had to start a brand new practice, you're going to have to make all those policies, the hours, the time, the commitment, the credentialing to pay for somebody to come on site. I mean, it's a lot of money that adds up to give value for. So the branding and the reputation, this one's a little more subjective. The patient value as far as loyalty and the reputation, the quality of care you give, and continuing that. So a lot of times we'll talk about the marketing budgets. Like a lot of times a well-established practice is very busy, waiting list. They don't really have a marketing budget. If you're a brand new practice, you're going to have to put 5-10% of your overhead expenses or overhead profits into a marketing budget. So there's financial value to having an established brand where people are calling and people know the quality of the service. All their friends deliver here. I mean, they've had, now the grandbabies are having kids there. There is financial value to that. You just have to objectively show it. And being very clear before you even list the practice and you're meeting with your expert team, what do you want to sell? What do you think is a rough, fair projection for that? And how are you going to get it? So if you feel like it's worth $1 million, but you have no profit margin the last 3 years, you should probably be working on improving your revenue streams, improving your profitability so that that financial value can be objectively negotiated with the prospective buyers. You can sell stocks with your practice. You could sell the entity itself, the membership ownership side. But there's a big difference. If you're selling the whole business, that business owner is going to buy the liabilities and the risk, not just a portion of the company, the profits and the decision making. So what type of transaction do you want with your practice? Do you want to sell a percentage of the ownership, or do you want to completely sell the building, the business, and the company as a whole? We talked about just people on your team. One of the most important people on your team is a lawyer. It's amazing how we have the best intentions. You loved working with this midwife for years, but contracts are not the strength of midwives and their potential buyers. There's legal jargon, there's exit clauses, there's all these little things that are going to protect both sides because they're clearly communicated. It's not one of these things you want to go on LegalZoom or just find a Google search of a generic buy-sell agreement and then meet with your friend for coffee and you guys work it out. There can be a lot of legal ramifications, short-term and long-term, of doing a deal without a lawyer being involved. They know the local rules. They know the local ways of legal jargon that has to be written so it's a smooth official transaction. Because if you're the bank and then all of a sudden they stop paying, do you have written in the buy-sell agreement when does foreclosure happen? When do you take over ownership? What does that timeline look like? The whole point of legal contracts is to clearly have a communication ahead of time, before the emotions, before a situation happens. What are you going to do if this happens? What are we going to do if this happens? Even on the buying side, the due diligence, you want to protect each other. That just like buying a house, when you do inspections or if they ask if there's anything wrong with the house, you're signing a contract saying, I am saying truthfully that there's nothing wrong. It's just like the birth center. If you have a legal case pending and you tell the next prospective buyer that you don't, you're breaking your contracts and you could lose the whole sale, and it could have some legal ramifications where you now may have to pay for that pending lawsuit because of your decisions. So there's a lot of really important things to do. You want to make sure that you have a smooth written transaction for the legal paperwork, the HIPAA, the contracts. There's so much involved with transacting a medical practice in particular smoothly. So you want to have a lawyer involved when you're negotiating. You want to have a lawyer involved looking at any legal paperwork before you sign it. That's just in general, like whether you're starting a practice and you're making your financial agreements, you're making employment contracts for staff, you're thinking about adding a business partner. Anytime you have a big financial and legal decision to make that you're putting your signature on, I strongly would encourage you to have a lawyer just glance over it to make sure there's no red flags or anything you're missing that should be written as a clause or an exit strategy to protect you. I don't think we give enough credit for even just the negotiating side and the legal verbiage for the business mentorship. You want to be clear, you want to be objective. You don't want a lot of subjective words in your contracts. You want to say, I am going to be worth $20,000 part of this business value because I will work for 10 hours the next 3 months to help you with XYZ things during office hours. You don't want to all of a sudden think, oh, they're going to stay on for 3 months. and you're counting them as salary, and then you stay on as the past business owner and you're frustrated because they're working you 70 hours a week, but you didn't have in writing what that salary looked like for the time you negotiated. So you want to be clear, you want to be objective, and you want to say, this is what is part of my business mentorship. I'm not going to run your practice, I'm going to be a resource for you. With the real estate, there's a lot of legal jargon. You want to make sure you do protecting you with the inspections and getting an appraisal, make sure that the zoning is still good. There's just so much you want to double check so that that assumed thing from a long time ago is not still the case, because all of a sudden the person is buying this building thinking they can run a birth center, and then all of a sudden the zoning is an issue and it changed 5 years ago, but you didn't know it. You just lost a lot of value for being able to run a business in a location that can't be done anymore. If there's any pending customer complaints, if there's any HIPAA transaction you want to keep compliance, you want to make sure your documentation, your staff is being trained well. You want to just make sure that you're doing a smooth transition from you being the business owner, so that when you are retired, you're not worrying about a lawsuit coming your direction because you were the business owner when it happened versus now there's a new business owner. So there's accounting, tax things to think about. This is my favorite one because I think too many times midwives pay way too much for taxes because we just don't understand the rules, the deductions, the games that have been created that accountants are very, very aware of and good at strategizing. So you want to plan ahead of time. You want to think about, okay, I want to sell all at once. I want to get X amount. I want to sell gradually over time. What do those tax implications look like? If I'm getting an income from the business after I sell, because there's different ways to get paid. You can get usual income, you can get so many capital gains. There's so many different structures of how you can get paid and how you can negotiate that contract of gradually. You can have a dividend. You could choose to keep some stocks in the practice and then you're getting a cut of the profits as the next 10 years. I mean, there's so many ways you can structure it, and that's really important to have an accountant on your team to talk about what short-term, long-term tax implications have on decisions you make. So we talked about it already, just the different things. You can hybrid a sale. I think most birth centers do a very good, successful transition when we do a combination of a down payment, 5 to 10%, to show they're serious, they're committed as the buyer. We make sure that the past owner stays on for about 18 months to 24 months to give them enough time to really get used to being a business owner, give some value, some revenue to the past owner before they completely retire. They get to watch their legacy thrive and the new practice owners, and it's a win-win situation. And so on the tax side, having that gradual income over time really will benefit you, and it's a different structure. When you're getting interest from the business loan, it's a different income bracket, a different structure than if you're just getting a straight sale of the business. So the listing price for the practice, you can disclose it. You could just put you're interested in selling, have somebody call you. You can decide how detailed you want your listing to be. I usually encourage people to make it more enticing and then have really good flyers and more private information after they sign a non-disclosure agreement that you can give to people that are either curious or serious. So vague publicly is nice. Having a good written listing flyer after they sign that non-disclosure agreement, and then after they do that, you touch base and say, okay, would you like to meet? Are you more considering this option based on that information you had just seen? There's different places you can list birth centers. Unfortunately, there's not a ton of them, and I know I'm working hard to try to get kind of like a Craigslist for midwives. So we can, when we're trying to look for students, we're trying to look for employed midwives, we're considering business partners, we're thinking about buying or selling practices. I am in the process of working on a central hub that midwives can communicate with each other, and it is a central place. At this point, it doesn't exist. It's more of just networking, word of mouth. Facebook groups are really helpful. There's a lot of private groups where midwives are part of, and you can just put the word out there. You can just say, hey, I'm interested in selling. This is the state I'm in. Here, private message me if you'd like to have a conversation. Even just talking to national organizations, they don't have any direct listings. Like AABC has job postings for midwives, and you can put your birth center listing up there, but it's traditionally used for hiring staff, not so much of selling and buying practices. But at least you can network with them. If you network with AABC, CABC, ACNM, MANA, you can at least get the word out there, so then if they get a call of somebody that's wanting to buy a birth center, they can send them your direction. So at least then you've got a third party connection to put you guys together. There's a lot of great business consulting services out there, and you'd be surprised how many inquiries we get about people interested in buying, people interested in selling. We put a list together. And then we just try to connect them together. I think as business consultants, it's not just about the knowledge, it's about the connections we create. We network you with the best of the best accountants, planners, people that understand midwives to make your business very successful, so you don't have to do all that extensive interviewing. But also we try to be that central hub of, if somebody is considering buying and selling a practice, we try to keep a list and keep connected with those people. So Midwifery Business Consultation, Grow Midwives, Midwifery Wisdom Collectives are the three main business consulting services I'm aware of. Social media platforms, I think, are the most common way that midwives, there's like a Midwives Anonymous, there's a bunch of different platforms with thousands of midwives on it, and I think just people putting it out there and saying, hey, I want to sell my practice, give me a shout out, and that way it's more on a national level, it's cheap, it spreads the word. So many midwives are on those social media platforms. So once you get prospective buyers and you figure out, are you serious? Are you curious? Are you just being nosy? You can ask those common questions. Why do they want to buy? Are they new out of school? Have they been practicing for a while? Have they been thinking about buying a practice? Do they live in the area? Are they going to be moving? Do they want to buy it as a business owner? Do they want to directly be a midwife part of the practice? Kind of get a sense of, oh, you'll find out quite quickly, oh, I was just nosy. I was just curious. I'm in the early stages, just thinking about it. Or, oh my gosh, I've been looking for years and your practice is perfect. I've been saving up money. I've been working with XYZ. I would love to buy your building in your birth center. That's a very different conversation than the ones we traditionally have of just, I'm just thinking about it. So when people are calling you or messaging you, there's going to be very key questions people are going to ask. They're going to want to know, why are you selling? They want to know your motivation. They want to know your timeline. They want to know, are they going to get a good deal? And maybe there's an issue problem with the practice, or you want to retire. They're going to want to know why you are selling. They're going to want to know what's being sold. Is it the supplies? Is it the building? Is it the business brand, the entity itself? Those are really important things for you to have a good sense of what you want to sell and what you don't want to sell. I have many midwives that'll want to sell the branding of the birth center, but they don't actually want to sell the building. They want to lease to the new business owners. And so that's really important for you to know ahead of time when you have that discussion. They want to be a real estate investor and they want to lease the birth center to the new owner. You have to have that very clear expectation from the beginning, because if that prospective buyer does not want to be a business owner and lease from you, you want to know ahead of time just so you can figure out, are you guys a good fit to be together as a transaction? They're going to want to know, are you making money? They're going to want to know your profit margins. They're going to ask to see your Schedule C on your tax forms for the last 3 years. Please make sure you have a non-disclosure agreement. Before you give any details, try to just give a high-level teaser to these common inquiry questions. And then once you filter out, are they serious or not serious, have a meeting, sign the non-disclosure agreement, get them that pertinent financial performances that they want, but you want to also protect the reputation of your practice. They're going to want to know the history. They're going to want to know the story of how you started the birth center, who you've been serving, where you guys are going. Have a tentative timeline of when you're wanting to sell. If you want to sell in 2 months versus 2 years, that's a very different discussion of their commitment and their inquiry of how fast they need to be thinking about it and making a decision. Because if you tell them you have 2 months, it's going to make them a lot more nervous to even consider having a discussion with you than if you tell them you have about 2 years of planning, that you would like to make a smooth transition to the next owner. Are you AABC accredited or not? They may be able to see that on your website. They may be able to see it on the CABC directory. And that's important. It has value. It's something that will definitely show that professional integrity. It'll show how you run a business. It'll help with your financial contracts. There's just a lot of benefits to these questions people are going to ask because they want to know how strong is your business. And if I take over, am I going to be successful? Am I going to take over on a well-run business, or am I going to take over on a struggling practice that the midwife gave her heart and soul to, but I'm going to lose money hand and fist when I take over on it? The last one isn't as common of a question. It's more once you get into the due diligence process, people will ask about pending claims, liability, anything out there that the business could be responsible for, because people don't realize when you sell that business, that risk stays with the business. You're buying the assets and the liabilities. So screen your inquiries, give them a good sense of how many active patients you have, get a good sense, for example, the commercial property market, it's now a seller's market. When you're trying to, or I should say it's more of a buyer's market, because there's so many commercial properties out there, it doesn't have as much value as it did a couple of years ago. So you have to really understand, you also are selling, and there's maybe not very many birth centers, but how many people are out there wanting to buy a birth center? So you have to think about your potential prospective buyers and being careful of building that relationship, because you're not going to have too many people selling birth centers, and you're not going to have too many people thinking of buying birth centers. Having that conversation of, I am open to staying on as you are the owner. I want to help support you. I want to transition you with the staff, the training, I want to be a business consultant. I want to be a midwife on team. Like, what is that relationship going to look like? Are you just going to close the day of closing, sign paperwork, and the past owner is going to start traveling the world and you just have to figure it out? I mean, there's value to making that smooth transition. How did you determine the price? If you say you want $1 million, you got to be able to objectively show them where that value is coming from, and list all of the assets, the tangible and intangible assets. Having staff that's tech savvy. Are you on paper? Are you on electronic medical system? Do you do billing in-house? Are you cash? Are you insurance? Like, these are things to think about once you're in that detailed screening due diligence process that people are going to ask about. But if you can have the answers ahead of time, and you can have, it's going to show you really got your ducks in a row. It's going to show the value. It's going to show, wow, she really knows how to run this practice. That non-disclosure agreement is so important. You want to protect your business structure. You don't want, as soon as you hand them your tax forms, they're going all over social media, friends and family, like, oh my gosh, did you know that birth center loses money every single year? That's not how you want to run it. So you definitely, and that's part of getting a lawyer on your team and talking about these risk reductions while you're looking for your prospective buyer. So before you give any nitty-gritty numbers and details to the practice, any prospective buyer, you need to have signed a non-disclosure agreement. The art of negotiation, I always talk to midwives, we have to be creative. We have to think of a win-win situation. What value do you have as the seller to that buyer? Why are they wanting to buy? What are the challenges do they have? Is it money? Is it the experience? Is it the resources? What you need to figure out what strengths you have as the seller that you can negotiate that'll add value to the buyer, whether it is the actual profit streams and continuing those contracts and those systems and the team you've created, or if it's just the financial component side. You want to build relationships. You want to make sure that the new staff loves the next owner and they're going to stay on, and that the patients are going to have a smooth transition, because you don't want a lot of anxiety of unknowns with everyone, because it's just going to make the profit margin and the success of the new owners that much harder. Everything's negotiable. I don't think people realize, if you can show the value of, if you had to do this as a brand new birth center yourself, it would cost you X amount. It would be 100 hours to make all these policies. Like, it's not just a financial thing, but your time has value behind it. I think a lot of people forget the value of the knowledge that the current owner has in negotiating that contract to stay on at some level of time after the deal is done, to be able to continue as a smooth transition. You want to ask lots of questions. You don't want to make any assumptions. Those breakdowns of communication. You don't want to just do a handshake. You don't want to just do a phone call and say that sounds good. You want everything in writing. You want email trails. You want your lawyers to look at anything you're going to sign. You want to have clear expectations of what you have for sale, what is not for sale. What is each person looking for? What are the challenges that both sides have? One person wants to buy, one person wants to sell, one person doesn't have the funds for a down payment, they've never ran a business before, the other person doesn't want to be the business owner anymore and doesn't want all the responsibility. So how do you exchange those things and put a value behind it? So the profit margins, the reputation, the staff, the supplies, the contracts, all of these things are up for negotiation. Maybe they just want to buy the birth center and the supplies, but they want to hire their own staff. They want to start from fresh with clients. They want to put a new branding sign up on the front of the building. They want to do something totally different. You just have to figure out what you're negotiating, what has value, what doesn't have value within your practice. The buying process, it can take some time. It usually takes 3 to 6 months because of the due diligence and looking things over. People are very nervous to make a big decision to buy a business, to put a lot of money down. It's like buying a large house. It's like you're responsible for all the staff and the clients you're taking on. So don't ever make the prospective buyer feel pressured. You want to be politely persistent on both directions, and you want to answer all their questions, and you want to make a clear timeline from the beginning of, hey, I want a month to think about it. We'll follow up with them in a month. If they ask for some documents, don't wait 2 weeks to send them to them. Like, you'd be surprised how many midwives, they'll come to me like, I don't think they're that interested in selling, even though they really are motivated, because I talk to them on the sidelines the other direction, but they're not sending paperwork. They're not improving that buying process. So it breaks down those transactions purely because there's not a smooth communication between the buyer and the seller during that due diligence process. A letter of intent is just an informal way to say, I'm committed, I'm serious, I'm not going to put any down payment down, I definitely want to talk about this more. It's just kind of that next level versus verbal. You have it in writing. There's no legal ramifications behind it. The down payment is that next level. If I do my due diligence, kind of like if you buy a house and you decide you want to walk away, you just have to have it written in the contract. So there's stages in the buying process of levels of commitment you can do. And just making sure you're respectful of each other during that process. So you want the very beginning. You guys have had a conversation. I'm thinking about buying your practice. I would love to learn more details about it. You send over an email with a non-disclosure agreement. They signed it. They looked over the paperwork. They met with their business partners. They met with their legal team. It looks good as a starting point. They send you a letter of intent. You guys they start doing their due diligence. They start looking in depth. They start meeting with your staff. They start talking to you about all these different things that are part of the practice that you're going to negotiate and that has the value. You want to get into details of, is it going to be a bank loan? Are you going to sell everything all at once at closing? Are you going to have seller financing? What does the terms of that agreement look like? And then just having your legal team drawing up those documents, giving both sides time to look at the paperwork. Usually a couple weeks you give once some new documents are drawn up, because it's a lot to think about and they want their legal team to look at it just as much as you do. And then the goal is you get a win-win, you get a fair price, you get a smooth transition of the new owners, and the families don't even know in the backdrops that a new owner took over for the practice. So after the paperwork is signed, this is kind of like that postpartum period. Like, we give so much credit as midwives in our society of birth, 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 birth. Well, that smooth transition, that business mentorship piece after the closing is like the postpartum period. It's still just as important. We want the mom and baby to bond. We want breastfeeding to go successfully. This past business owner, even though on paper they don't own the business, they know the ins and outs of this practice. And so that smooth transition for whatever timeline, 3 months, 6 months, 18 months, having that business owner help with transitioning the staff, the education piece, showing how to do things, where things are at. It's a big learning curve buying a birth center, especially if the midwife buying it is planning on being full-time clinically within the practice. That's a lot for them to take on and make sure that these systems and flows don't fall through the crack that have been established. So you want to make sure, if you're going to decide to tell the families or not. Sometimes if it's a midwife director, they may just say she's retiring. If it's a well-established practice, they're going to know she was the past owner, and they're going to want to know who owns it now. So you can decide how you want to inform the community of, it's just a new team of midwives, and they may or may not know who the business owner is in the backdrops. So understanding the terms of the sale agreement, this comes down to that legal, not so fun stuff, but you really want to have a lawyer look at it. You really want to have some time to read every little part. If there's things that are not said, those are gaps of disagreements, and that causes a lot of the legal liability risk later on. You want clear expectations of what's being bought, what's being sold, what is this transaction looking like? Are we going to part ways as soon as it's closed? Are you going to be on as a business mentor? Are you going to be, what level of relationship we're going to have once the paperwork is signed? So yeah, I love the business mentorship side for birth centers. There's few birth centers, there's few well-established, successful birth centers, and there's so much knowledge those midwives have that have immense value to pass on to the next generation. And they can be on in different levels. They can be on as just a temporary worker that is not benefited. They could be on as a consultant. They could be on as an employed midwife on the staff. They can be an independent contractor. And so there's different levels. They can be clinical support with the team. They could be helping with just educating the new owner where everything's at, how they do things. Learning hard knocks is a very difficult thing to do. So if you can have some time to say, hey, 5-10 hours a week, I will sit down with you. I'll have weekly meetings. You're running the practice. I don't want to be there anymore, but I'll commit 2 hours a week to Zoom calls that I can help you with what's going on, questions you have. You can email me with things. Like, you just want to have in clear writing what that communication looks like, what the boundaries are, what you're offering as that mentorship relationship. So transitioning the staff, you just want to make sure that everybody is aware and that it's a positive transition. And it just takes time because they're going to have to learn the new owner and the new structure. There's some things are going to stay the same and some things aren't. And so we want to, they've got a built up trusting relationship with that past owner. And so it just takes time to build those type of relationships and trust. And they're going to be anxious and nervous to want to know that the bills are still going to be paid, the birth center is still going to be there, their paychecks are going to clear every 2 weeks. There's a lot of anxiety they're going to have that you've got to alleviate and give them confidence. You've got a plan in place. Some buyers and sellers may have non-compete clauses with the past owners, with the current staff, so that meaning they can't go somewhere else and start a birth center across the street. Some states will honor it, some states won't. So you just have to, that's part of having a legal discussion. You'd assume that all the staff's just going to stay on, but what if they're like, okay, I'm just going to start, I was thinking about starting my own birth center. I didn't really want to buy this one. You bought it. I'm taking all the staff and their loyalty across the street and we're going to start a birth center. Like, you want to have those discussions with the current owners. What does the staffing relationship look like? Do they want to stay on with the new owner? Are they considering buying it themselves? Maybe it might be making more sense to do a business partner relationship with the already established midwives and team that know the history of the practice really well. Transition with the community, you can decide what level of awareness everybody's going to have. You can decide if you want to make it totally public and have a big party, if you want to just make it discreet, and then the clients just don't know. It just really depends on how the practice is structured and how you want the future relationship with those clients to look. So that exiting strategy for the owners, it can be multiple different ways. It could be just you close the paperwork, they leave. It could be a gradual thing over a month. It could just be phone calls here and there when they're traveling. It could be they're on full time as a midwife, as administration while you get things all figured out. It really, if you're a newer midwife, an experienced midwife, if you've never ran a business before, there's a huge learning curve. And I would much rather you learn from the expert, including the past owner, than hard knocks. You are going to save so much time, money, and headaches of all these things that past owner knows. And I want that value given to the past owner. So you want to make clear expectations for that transitional period. So benefits of just planning, I can't stress it enough. I know we talked in the beginning about Jill and Jane and the types of midwives I talk to that are considering or abruptly wanting to sell their birth centers. Having time to plan, having all these different things thought out is going to decrease the anxiety. It's going to increase the profit margin. It's going to improve the transition to the new owner. It's going to find you a new owner. Like, the financial benefits, short-term, long-term, and just that peace of mind. Your community birth center is going to be around for another 30, 40 years because you've made a smooth transition. I mean, the whole point as midwives is we want to build a growth within our midwifery community, and our families have access to birth centers. If we are abruptly burning out and don't have time to sell our practices, we are losing these wonderful, wonderful practices that it just breaks my heart when I hear the part where we don't have time to plan. We don't have the business strategies in place to get a new owner of their birth center.